Good evening, everyone. This is Jean-Paul Spagnolo, and I'm presenting on Chapter 8 of our leadership text. The chapter is entitled Leadership as the Legitimation of Doubt by Carly Weick. This chapter starts off with an allegory for leadership in the 21st century centered around a moment in the life of Warren Bennis. At this particular time, Warren Bennis was the president of the University of Cincinnati, and he was giving a lecture at Harvard University for their College of Education. During the question and answer period of the evening, Warren was asked a question that threw him a little bit for a loop. He was asked, quote, "Warren, do you really love being president of Cincinnati?" Bennis didn't have a snappy answer. In fact, it took him a moment to respond, and after a little bit of a dramatic silence, he simply stated, "I do not know." Shortly thereafter, he came to the realization that he loved being a college president, but he hated managing and doing a college presidency, and so he left Cincinnati. What's interesting about this story is that Warren could have answered a simple yes or no. Instead, he went after a response that was a little bit different. In his response, he opened himself up to doing a search for meaning, maybe giving himself a sense of direction, and also taking a moment for sense-making. And that's what this chapter really starts to focus on, is this idea and concept of sense-making in leadership. So to define sense-making a little bit, or to kind of lay it out, the groundwork for it, I'm going to take a quote directly from our author. Quote, "To lead in the future is to be less in the thrall of decision-making and more in the thrall of sense-making." When we think of sense-making, we really are looking at the world as a place that is quite unknowable and very unpredictable. In fact, we also look at it in a way that we've been thrown into things. Oftentimes, as leaders, we don't know exactly what it is that we've been thrown into. Things change around us because of the unpredictability and the unknowable place that we live in. And this really lines up well with a lot of leadership theory that has been popular in recent years on ideas of quantum theory and chaos theory. And according to these theories, the world is less like a machine and more like sharing patterns of relationships. And so when we think of leaders as leaders today, we're not looking necessarily at just all the different parts of a machine and how to get from A to B, but we also have to look at the pattern relationships in that process. And that really is something that becomes important when we think of sense-making and how it has an impact or a potential impact in the way that we view leadership. So to kind of expand a little bit on quantum theory and chaos theory, I took another quote directly from our author. "Because the nature of the world is unknowable, chaos theory and quantum theory, we are left with only sense-making. Even if we had the capacity to do more, doing more would not help. Quantum theory helps us to understand that the present state of the world is at best a probability distribution. As we learn from chaos theory, the next state of the world is unknowable, and so we must pay attention to the world as it unfolds." As I started reading this chapter, I really thought that was an interesting statement. Kind of, for me, was something that made me really start to think about this idea of sense-making. What is it that we're trying to do? When we are leaders, do we really have the answers, or are we really spending a lot more time trying to understand the process and making sure that we come up with solutions that are going to be viable in the moment? So let's think about sense-making a little bit. The concept of sense-making is more like thinking about things in terms of a compass and not a map. If you think about sense-making in this kind of a place or a visual representation, maps can only help in known worlds. They're designed to help us with places that have been charted before. The mainstay of a map is on performance. It's making sure that we are able to stick with things and be able to see how our performance is done, managing performance. Compasses, on the other hand, are helpful when we're not sure where we are exactly, and they help provide with us a general sense of direction. In this idea, if you're thinking about sense-making as a mainstay, it focuses more on learning and renewal. So leadership challenges of the 21st century. Uncertainty will be based less on insufficient facts and more on insufficient questions. There will be fewer experts and more novices. There will be more of a premium on staying in motion than on detaching and reflecting. There will be more migration of decisions to those with expertise to handle them, and less convergence of decisions on people entitled by rank to make them. Some other challenges include that there will be fewer attempts to capture the big picture and more attempts to capture the big story, with its ongoing and dynamic plot. There will be more focus on updating and plausibility and less on forecasting and accuracy. And there will be more improvisation and fewer routines. Of course, there will also be more humility and less hubris. All of these things combined to me really kind of lay out a good foundation of what it means to think about sense making. As you look at the different challenges, the reality is that there's not necessarily quick answers or that there's a clear vision of direction of everything that we have to do. Instead, it kind of is a place where we need to understand and maybe embrace a little bit more ambiguity and consider what it is that we need to do to get through the process. And that's when sense making kind of comes into this particular place. So an effective leader that's really looking for sense making and trying to take on this particular paradigm is someone who's searching for a better question. They're also in this moment, they're not just looking at what the answer is, but they're actually saying, what are the best questions? What do we really need to know in order for us to be effective? In addition, they also accept inexperience. They don't always think that everybody's going to be perfect, that everybody has the right answer, and that things are just going to come easily. Instead, they're always staying in motion. They're moving forward with things. They're not staying stagnant, and they want to make sure that they are effectively moving things within their organization. Another thing that they do is they like to channel decisions to those who have the best knowledge for the matter at hand. I think this is a really important thing for leaders to consider, because oftentimes I think many leaders get caught up in their own rhetoric, and when they do that, there's a chance that they might lose some of the best options that are out on the table because they're kind of stuck in their own sense of self and not paying attention to what others might be able to contribute who have a better knowledge of particular bits of information. They also are very, very good at crafting stories, and I've seen this a lot in my own particular experience with leaders. The best leaders seem to be able to always share things through story. And as we do that, when you think about the concept of storytelling, it's not something where people have a direct, exact, black and white way of looking at things. Instead, when people tell stories, they open it up for us to use our imagination, and we start to draw some of our own conclusions. And in doing that, we're actually opening ourselves up to a little bit of sense-making as well. The other thing is, another thing of an effective leader is that they're obsessed with updating, that they keep trying to move forward with things, not just as they are, but are looking for things as they might become. In doing that, they also encourage improvisation. They think that at times it's important, and it's not just looking at impromptu as something that they're doing haphazardly. Instead, it's understanding what's been done in the past and being able to maybe look at potentials of the future, and then in those moments using improvisation to try to get there. So another thing that they also look at as an effective leader is to be deeply aware of their own personal ignorance. And I don't know about you, but I know for me that is something that can be a challenge at times, to be able to admit when you might not know the answer. And so an effective leader who's trying to make sense of the world and trying to lead more as a person that's looking for direction is also willing to be able to say, you know what, they don't know at times. And that's kind of what we see in the very beginning story of Warren Bennis, that ability to be able to be humble enough to say, I don't know. So if you're leading by the compass, there are several different things that we should consider with it. 5 particularly are highlighted by the book. The first one is this idea of animation. If you're a leader that's leading in this world of trying to make sense, you have to recognize that people stay in motion, have direction, and you need to look closely and update often. Also make sure that you're having good conversation with those that you lead. Being very candid about what needs to be said to those that you're working with. And as you do that, you start to be able to see, again, a place where you're starting to make sense of something together, and you're using this sense of direction to get you to the end. Another thing is this idea or concept of improvisation, which I spoke a little bit about earlier, but again, it's an important part of understanding or using a compass maybe as an anchor to lead. And in this place of improvisation, it's also dealing with reworking previously experienced material in relation to unanticipated ideas that are conceived, shaped, and transformed under the special conditions of a current performance. Again, it's kind of taking a place of looking at things as they've been in the past. It's also looking at things as they may perceive or become possibilities in the future, and then making a wise decision or choice in the moment, and being able to work with things in the moment. The next thing that they talk about in the book is this idea of lightness. And this is something that I think for me was very, aha moment or eye-opening. And a leader that's doing this is somebody, as they're trying to make sense, they're dropping the heavy tools of rationality. So, there's a whole bunch of different things that they talk about in the book on how we gain access to lightness. And I like that visual representation of actually dropping something and actually looking for something that is light. And so if you think about these words in terms of lightness, or even lightness in relation to weight, I think it is something that kind of draws to the attention a lot of what it takes to be able to be a person that's making sense of things. So the list here is intuition, feelings, stories, experience, active listening, shared humanity, awareness in the moment, capability for fascination, awe, novel words, and empathy. Leaders that are doing these things really have the ability to start to make sense of things, and I like that concept a lot. I don't know why, but it really hit me hard when I was reading the chapter. That oftentimes we get so caught up in the rational way of doing things, and we oftentimes forget some of these other things that make us a little bit lighter on our feet, that also help us to make sense of what we're dealing with. The next one is this authentication, and that's that place where we're just becoming real. And I think that's a really important thing for leaders to consider if they're trying to make sense within an organization. That quote again comes up often throughout this particular chapter. I don't know. For a leader to be willing to say I don't know is a powerful statement. Another thing that they need to do is be very truthful and have factual responses for those that they're working with. And by doing that, it also helps them to establish credibility, especially living in this unknown world. And so as they're trying to make sense with others, the big thing they need to do is make sure that they're establishing credibility. They invite instead of precluding people. They're trying to make sure more people are involved, and they focus on strengths rather than weaknesses in relationships. They want to make sure that they are trying to make people come together closer, that they're working together stronger, and that they're not, pulling apart from one another. The last thing they talk about as far as leading by the compass is to use learning and recognizing the importance of learning in the process. The process of sense-making really does end with something being learned. It's about people learning together, and learning is really wisdom stripped of hubris. So this place where there's humility engaged in the process. And as leaders do these things, they have the ability to use this power of sense-making to really push forward, the direction that they're trying to take an organization. And, as I kind of contemplate some of my last thoughts on this as we wrap this up, is that this idea of sense-making is a really powerful notion or tool for leaders that are trying to work in a world that really is changing. I think oftentimes when we look at how people have access to information through the web and through other places so much easier in today's world, it takes a different type of leader to be able to help organizations go through this process of making sense together. And, I think that there's a lot of power in the leader that has the ability to work with an organization through that process. So with that being said, I had a couple of questions for the group to process a little bit. And of course, I'll type these up in the discussion board as well. The first one is, have you ever experienced a process of sense-making within your institution? If so, please describe the experience and outcomes. If not, how could your institution benefit from this paradigm of leadership? The second question I have for you is, the chapter discusses many benefits of leading through sense-making. However, it does not present the challenges. What do you perceive to be the possible drawbacks or challenges for an individual or organization seeking to adopt this style of leadership? I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and look forward to hearing some of your responses as we go through this process together. Have a good evening.